Welcome everyone to Technium's end-to-end webinar series. Today we are hosting the final webinar of the series, Turning Security from a Project into a Process. Our presenter today is Michael Joseph, Technium's co-founder and CTO. Before I turn it over to Mike, I'd just like to let you know that if you have a question during the webinar, please put it in the Q&A chat and we will address it at the end. With that, Mike, I'll hand it over to you to present turning security from a project into a process.
Thanks very much, Melissa. So we're sort of at the end of our series here, and I think it's going to be very interesting to sort of tie it all together. So what I'm hoping to do here is, in addition to talking about turning security from a project into a process, I'm also going to tie together the 4 webinars and sort of show you how we need to actually look at each of the discussions that we've had from the same perspective. So what we've done to date is we've talked about your Internet Reimagined, which is a presentation I did, which focused on how the evolution of how connectivity works has been changing and how we've been disrupting that here locally in the Boston area primarily. We had Ben Russell do The World of Wireless, which was a great look at new technologies in wireless and also sort of the domain of wireless itself changing. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that ties into our project and process formula as well. And then we had Sherry Davidoff, who's a renowned security expert and speaker and trainer, talk about email hacking and financial fraud, which it's a good lead into our sort of security closing here. So one observation that I like to say when I talk to people about the importance of this topic is from the standpoint of environments that we've been brought in to do assessments in, we have yet to see a single environment that didn't require a significant overhaul. And that may be a strong statement, but the reality is that it's a sad situation because of the fact that this concept of how security is facilitated and implemented is just not done with the right mindset. And the first question that I always think about is, how did this happen? And the truth is, it's not because anyone has set out to have a poor security situation. It's certainly not for lack of effort to apply security as an important feature in a business. It really fundamentally comes from a lack of understanding that security is very, very different, and your protection mechanisms for security are very different. And so I think the best way, and the reason why we came up with this concept for a webinar, because we've seen the pitfalls of this as evidenced by these environments that we've been asked to assess, and just discussions with IT leaders about their challenges. The real reason, the real factor that has contributed to security either being degraded or degrading over time is because these items that we've talked about, the internet, the connectivity and Internet Reimagined, the world of wireless, and the email compromises are all impacted by treating these as something that can be done one time and completed and move on. So we need to start changing our thinking from it's not a project, it's the beginning of a process. And this is just a great image, and it's sort of a mindset that I think it comes out of the military, this idea of left of boom, right of boom. And the concept is, on the left-hand side would be the set of things you do to avoid the event occurring. And in our world of security, these are the proactive measures that we put in place. The firewall management, vulnerability management, all of these things here that are very, very focused on hardening the environment to limit risk. In terms of the right of boom, that would be the items that we're doing after the event occurs and responding to that event. So in the world of security, the way I think it's very important to have the perspective of there are items that we can do, there's work we need to do to harden the environment and protect ourselves from harm, with the full expectation that the inevitable is we're going to be breached at some point, and we need a plan for when that happens. That's one of the reasons why all of the compliance and audit that happens within particularly financial services industries, but also any public companies, focus on what are you doing to protect yourself? What's your process? And then what are your processes for protecting yourself once the inevitable event happens? So it can be construed as a proactive item to put in place the set of things you will do in a reactive manner when the ultimate event happens. So what is a project, right? A project has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you feel great, you finish something, and all activities can be defined in some way as projects, but the projects at the end point need to be turned into something different. So what we want to talk about, and this is where our focus today is going to be, and everything we're going to stitch back together, is how do we change the methodology of everything we do? And I've been in a number of different events lately that have all been really informative and impactful to me about decision making that's focused on, instead of what do I need to do, how am I going to manage it? So the process focus is, what am I going to do to then be able to manage it effectively? It's one of the biggest reasons why when everyone that's a security professional will tell you, you need to implement what you can handle supporting and what you can know is working. So let's compare this to something in life that matters. So your health, right? Your health is comprised of eating right, exercising, getting a sufficient amount of rest, investing in your emotional well-being, and then having regular checkups where you might be told you need to eat right, you need to do some better exercise so you lose weight, you look tired and that's causing stress, your environment is contributing to you, the environment and your personal well-being are contributing to your lack of health. So the human body is effectively a process that we need to invest in for our ongoing health. So this is just an example of why, if you just did one thing, you're not going to be in a good place. So we want a process like this for our security. And if you don't do it as a process, it's going to end up degrading, and we're going to assess your environment and find that it's broken. So this is a fairly simple methodology that we've come up with over 20 years of trying to communicate the best way to solve really any potential problem or any design. And it's really been part of the ethos of our company, and it's been a methodology that we followed. And while it may seem very simple, it's quite important to think about this in some depth. So first of all, understand. I remember one of my first jobs, I was asked the question, working in a military guidance role, what the most important thing about guidance was. And the general that I was talking to asked me, what's the most important thing about guidance, Mike? And I was so proud of myself because I knew about yaw and various elements of how you calculate how to actually shoot a missile and hit something. I knew all those things, and everything I said, he said, wrong, wrong, wrong. And the answer was, know where you are. First of all, understand where you are. So a transparent view of where you are as an organization from the standpoint of your security is something that needs to be done on a regular basis. Reassess where you are. Fortify are the small projects service initiatives, improvements that you make to enhance the environment, and then be open and transparent about how you could do it better. Operationalize means as you're understanding what needs to be done and then fortifying it with these changes and improvements, what are you doing to make sure that you know if it's working, and how can you get alerts and notifications if it's not? So if you think back to that slide I showed earlier with the left of boom, if you're implementing those things on the left-hand side, how are you creating a system to actually notify you that something isn't right? How are you checking on it? And then should you find something that isn't working properly, re-understand, re-fortify, and operationalize again. So let's talk about understand as it relates to some of the presentations that we've done so far. So we talked about these 3 presentations so far: your internet reimagined, the world of wireless, and email hacking and financial fraud. So what would understand elements of each of those be? So, and we do this frequently working with customers about improving their overall connectivity. First thing is to understand what you currently have for circuit technology, connectivity technology. We then need to understand what your utilization of cloud applications are. Now, this could also be data center, it doesn't have to be cloud, but as most organizations that we work with and most businesses are moving more and more to cloud utilization, whether it be public cloud infrastructure, private cloud infrastructure, cloud utilization is strongly contributing to how your connectivity needs to be designed. And even the word internet and how we can avoid the wide open internet is important. And then it's always helpful in the evaluation of your internet current usage to get a snapshot of your current network usage. So that's how we understand your internet. Now, in the world of wireless, we learned from Ben Russell that there are different Wi-Fi bands. So there's your 2.4 band, your 5, your 6, and your 6 extended. So first of all, understanding that these bands exist and they all have different pros and cons, but they progressively get more powerful. Second of all, Wi-Fi 6E in particular, the capabilities here have really changed the landscape and provided the opportunity to do designs that can actually reduce or eliminate hardwiring, but actually require more capacity on the LAN, local area network, than we've ever needed before. And the last one is that different application profiles have different latency requirements, and solving for a good design, understanding the wireless needs in terms of the latency of these applications. And then if we look at email hacking and financial fraud, I think we saw from the many examples Sherry provided the importance of business email compromises. I personally was really impacted when I learned how much of the total financial fraud that occurred was facilitated through business email. I didn't realize that business email was such a big factor in that and how much money was actually lost. And then I think we saw a number of examples of how the email compromise works. Invoice fraud, gift cards, etc. Really interesting how that is actually mechanized. And then we saw the BEC lure. It's a concept of how you actually lure your victim in. So understanding that helps drive your ability to react to this. So then if we move on to fortify, and we again talk about our 3 areas, your internet reimagined, the world of wireless. So in fortify for internet reimagined, what we described there is, and I think this has become, maybe 10 years ago, we were talking about redundancy from the standpoint of this is something you really should have. Now, as we've realized that people's networks, particularly cloud connected networks, which are interacting with the cloud, the redundancy really is so important because the network has become your new production line. And if your production line isn't redundant and resilient, you can't function, your business won't work. So this is sort of an obvious but important business statement. And then the fabric itself is a way of fortifying your access to various needs that you will have. And hopefully we showed during that presentation how powerful the capabilities are there. And then if we move into wireless, Wi-Fi assessments still have a very important place. And you could almost argue, and I'll talk about this in the operationalizing, that Wi-Fi assessments are not a one-time event. But in the case of fortification, we need to know what we have. By running an assessment, an active fortification can be accomplished. And then Ben talked about all of the things that are new, especially with Wi-Fi 6E in design, and how we can factor those in and redesign. And what we talked about at the very end of the World of Wireless presentation is all of the new innovations that help with reporting. So these can all be considered activities that can resolve or improve the environment, that therefore fortifying a better experience. And last, under email hacking and financial fraud, Sherry showed how some of the things you can do to fortify is to, and a lot of these are education based, check the from field, make sure it actually makes sense versus it's just a label. Look for the urgent messages and question them, because urgent messages are often ways of creating emotion for people to do things that will do you harm. Cybersecurity awareness training is so critical. Doing it once, and I'm going to repeat it again, in operationalization is good. Doing it as a process is significantly better. Multi-factor authentication has clearly been one of the biggest saving graces for security professionals for quite a while. We believe by having the second factor of authentication, you create a lot of protection for yourself. But what Sherry talked about was the financial services industry has created out-of-band verification as a requirement. And this was a good learning experience for me listening to her talk about that, because what this basically means is that anything that's been mechanized as a multi-factor authentication, that is part of the same system, versus out-of-band, which might be physically get on a video session or make a phone call to someone to validate that something is real. So that creates that extra layer that can't be built into the service, and therefore protects you from harm, because if the multi-factor authentication itself has been hacked, then the criminal can redirect you to their source, and out of band ensures that's not possible. And so now let's look at really the material parts of today's talk. How do we operationalize all of these things that we've talked about? So, and we'll spend a little bit more time here because this is the real crux of the talk. So your internet reimagined. So we've done a wonderful job of evaluating the environment, establishing this modern connectivity, building into that connectivity the services that you require, ensuring that it's built with capacity and redundancy. But again, how do we operationalize that and know that it's serving the business needs? What if things change over time? What if there's an endemic problem that we haven't seen? So we strongly recommend, either internally or externally, that organizations establish 24/7 monitoring and analysis. So one without the other is not very useful. So if we perform an ongoing monitoring of this new internet connectivity, and we have either triggers that automatically alert us or a dashboard that we can look at that shows the performance over time, this is really helpful. Situational awareness. So in the event that you add a new piece of lab equipment into your environment, if that piece of lab equipment suddenly increases your network burden by 30%, and you can see that, and you have monitoring characterizing that, you'll know that that could, or maybe not, cause an impact on the organization. So we can't stress strongly enough. And one of the things that's great about the fabric itself is that the fabric, by its very nature and design, is more of a service provider construction. What this means, and I talked about this in our first presentation, is that the fabric is built and managed and monitored as a critical infrastructure. Therefore, if anything were to happen within the Fabric environment, there's near instant response to remediate the situation versus a dependence on non-operationalized infrastructure in your office. And then this idea of a dedicated team approach to remediation, the approach there is we need to make sure that we have people that are committed to the solution of the connectivity and overall security and working on your behalf. That's often a third party. It can be built internally, of course, but that's where a good third party relationship comes in. And when we go to the world of wireless, we start to look at the things that are operationalizable here. This is actually remarkable new technology that we've seen. And like a lot of great innovations, what's happening in wireless is really transformational. Because if you sort of think about the change in our world pre and post COVID, and I know we've over discussed COVID in a lot of presentations, but COVID changed wireless more than any change that I've ever seen from a influence on a technology perspective. What happened, and I always say this, that as a network professional, I've always said it's the network until proven otherwise. If there's a problem, assume it's the network, prove it's not, and then go figure out is this a server, application, user, etc. Nowadays, that statement has completely changed. Since users function in a wireless way, you'll hear about problems in your environment and your user experiences as wireless problems. They're all wireless problems. And what we found is by implementing this very innovative and new technology that's available, that's in the Gartner quadrant that's called Wi-Fi assurance. Wi-Fi assurance is technology that does proactive monitoring of Wi-Fi. But again, like all new and innovative technologies, it's finding other value propositions. In order to evaluate the quality of the Wi-Fi experience, the way that is done, and Ben talked about this quite a bit, is by doing user experience monitoring application by application. So instead of saying, hey, the CPU is overburdened on a firewall, the monitor, the wireless monitor, will say Teams performance just got outside of reasonable norms. When that sort of experience happens and you can convey it in a way that says, in this particular area of the building, users are likely to be having Microsoft Teams problems, now you're speaking the same language. So you're actually doing end user customer experience evaluation all the time. So now your wireless is going to get better, your user communication is going to get better, and you'll have, as I said before, situational awareness. And so what it comes now, and the other thing that's really important in wireless, and I know Ben talked about this, and this goes to my COVID comment, is what happens if something changes dramatically to affect the environment that wireless is serving? COVID was my great example of this, because pre-COVID, people were using wireless, but they were using it for low video, primarily data stream. And then everybody leaves the office, goes home, gets used to this idea of being on video to have an interactive meeting. Then they come back to the office, and what we found, and every single customer we worked with was having wireless problems. The reason was because the actual network wasn't broken, it wasn't designed for the use cases. So to operationalize and consider this be a regular process, what we need to do is have a regular check-in on what's changed. We often like to say to businesses, if you can get a rhythm with business leadership whereby when they're making changes, hiring, bringing in new equipment, making significant construction changes, even sort of different tools that are being used, if they can partner with the IT and technology world to make sure that that information is readily available, we can adapt more proactively. So engage in these discussions. Think of it as wireless, but it's much more than wireless. It's having a engaged conversation with the organization about potential changes, and it'll manifest itself in wireless. And the last one is the email hacking and financial fraud. How do we turn that into a process? Well, it's very simple. Cybersecurity awareness training. Sherry talked about KnowBe4. KnowBe4 is a really good tool. There are others, but these guys just seem to be the leader. What I think is really cool about it is that it allows you flexibility to create your own training modules at your own rhythm. And so instead of just saying, go take this training module, what you can do is you can do campaigns where you deliberately try to trick people into falling for various event profiles. The reason why this is a process is you build these campaigns, you schedule how frequently they're going to be done, and you should adapt them to what's happening within the environment. So again, as Sherry showed, you could create an email that has urgent in it and see how many people fall for it. You could create a campaign that focuses on a social engineering aspect, something that happens within your environment. These campaigns are really powerful because they can be run and they can set the organization up for retraining. So an example of that is, let's say someone in the organization falls for that urgent message. You can say, okay, this was only a test. You didn't harm the business this time, but if this were real, you would have really caused harm. Let me show you what could have happened. And then you train the person on this. They have the reaction that they get, that they've been caught. And then the whole simulated experience causes a memory which they'll maintain and they'll behave differently. So I feel like cybersecurity awareness training is a public service that every organization should be doing, not only to protect themselves, but to protect their own people from harm. Because every security professional that works particularly in the incident response area will tell you your weakest link is your user, but your user goes home and your user interacts with other people. So the more you can empower and train the user themselves, the better. Another one is instituting a process for training business leaders. So this is a protocol process, and it's often policy as well. So what happens in this particular case, and what I'm trying to highlight here is, and again, this is an ongoing thing, is continuously review your processes, continuously ensure that your leaders are aware of the processes, adapt your insurance, adapt your partnerships, adapt your technology to fight the changes that are happening, and make sure that all of these things are under continuous review. It's why having security leadership, security partnerships, we need more capacity than any organization has on their own. And the last item, and this is something that Sherry Davidoff's firm is remarkable at, they're fantastic, they're actually well regarded and known for this, is incident response. So incident response is something that at its core has the following factors. One is an understanding of the business. So your incident response firm should know that you have cyber insurance, that you have a particular protocol for handling an incident and how that's going to be messaged. They typically will want to know about your communications responsibilities. So by industry, internal and external, etc. And a really good incident response firm, when partnered with you, sometimes there's not even a charge for it, but the idea is to establish the relationship with your incident response firm such that when that right of boom event occurs, you're all set. But I've actually seen this in action, and it's so powerful when there's already an incident response engagement and that critical event happens. You call the incident response firm and they come in and they actually start running the show because they've done this before. They know how to communicate. They know how to do the forensics to find out how the incident happened. They know how to help you shut it down so that it doesn't continue, so it doesn't get worse. They know how to teach you how to do the marketing communications external from your organization. And then they often will help you leverage financial capabilities, financial recovery capabilities that you can access through your insurance. But all of this requires proper documentation and process. If you have a hope, if damage is done, there's a hope of recovering money, you need to follow a process. And again, a good incident response firm will help set you up for this and even help you run tabletop exercises and practices. And so this is why the thinking here in all three of these areas is from the standpoint of a process. So I hope we've talked about the value of a process to the degree that it makes sense, and that you understand that it's a system. It has to be a system. In anything that you do, think of the following sort of like taglines. Anything you implement, make sure you can manage. Anything you manage, make sure you know if it's working. Anything that you know that it's working, make sure it's still working to meet the business needs, re-understand, re-fortify, re-operationalize. If you follow a process-oriented approach in the business, it'll be far better for the organization, and it's not going to end up in a situation where when we come in to do an assessment, it's a complete overhaul. And thank you everybody for the time, really appreciate it. And I'm Michael Joseph, and happy to answer any questions that might come up.
All right, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A chat, and I will make sure Mike gets that question. We do have one that came in during your presentation, Mike, and it says, where would I actually start if I wanted to shift the mindset of my company around security? You spoke about a lot that cannot be implemented. What is step one?
So what is step one? So I think from a security perspective, if I were to do one thing, it would be awareness training, because I think if we acknowledge that the users are the critical risk, I think that by getting awareness for your users, and then in parallel with that, because I think we need to do more than one thing, I would establish an incident response relationship in partnership with that, because those two process-oriented elements are going to be very instrumental and informative to the organization. So let me kind of answer it as three things. So one is institute security awareness training as a process. Number two would be establish a relationship with a good incident response firm. And number three, bring that incident response in to speak to leadership about security, because there's no better voice about the reason and the why to do it than to talk to someone who faces the outcome of bad security every day. And forensics companies, incident response organizations, they can really educate boards and CEOs, et cetera. And again, I highly recommend Sherry's firm. I think her firm is great, but if not her firm, somebody to actually work with you in partnership to get this all set up. But that's how I would approach it, because you need to win the hearts and minds first. And the security awareness training kind of is a bottom-up approach, get visibility into how good or bad your user community is. And the incident response and board discussions and leadership discussions with security experts is the top-down approach.
Okay. Oh, as of right now, we have no other questions in our Q&A chat. I would like to just do a quick announcement and remind everyone that the recordings of all 4 webinars will be published next week. You'll get an email with a link to where they live so you can watch them on demand. And if you have any friends or colleagues that might be interested, you may reach out to us. We can send them a link. Our contact information is at the bottom of the screen. There are no other questions right now, so I guess we'll wrap it up, Mike.
Thanks, Melissa. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.